Cops of Reddit. What's the worst call you've ever had to respond to? Story 1. I worked in digital forensics for law enforcement. One of our larger operations involved executing search warrants across multiple homes in a major California city. At one residence in a modest neighborhood, we served a warrant related to the possession and distribution of illegal material involving minors. The suspect matched the classic stereotype people often imagine: thin, quiet, and living with a disabled spouse who couldn't navigate stairs and hadn't been upstairs in years. When we searched the upper floor, we found a room secured with an outside padlock. Inside, the room was dark, with blacked-out windows and an eerie setup. Dolls were scattered around, many altered in disturbing ways. It was clear the individual had severe psychological issues. The room felt like something straight out of a horror film, and I still remember the unsettling image of the suspect's yellowed fingernails and vacant expression. While not everyone involved in such crimes looks the same, we noticed many shared traits like poor social skills and low self-esteem. It's a chilling reminder that the most dangerous people often hide in plain sight. Story 2. We received a welfare call for a man who hadn't been seen in several days. A neighbor was concerned because the house lights had been on continuously and a recent snowstorm showed no footprints or tire tracks. I arrived to find the house unlocked. Inside were the man's phone, wallet, keys, and some cash lying on the counter. The TV was still on. After searching the property thoroughly, including the garage and a number of old vehicles, I found no sign of him. We issued a missing person alert and prepared documentation for national databases. The next day, a colleague followed up. It turned out the man had suffered a medical emergency while plowing his driveway and crashed into the junk vehicles, which then caught fire. His remains were discovered in the burned vehicle, now just a pile of bones covered by snow. I had been just feet away from him the night before. It still haunts me how close I was without realizing. Story 3. This story comes from a friend who volunteered with a rural fire department in Colorado. We were together when he got dispatched to a motorcycle crash deep in a canyon road. A biker had tried to pass a car on a curve and collided head-on with a truck. Even though he wore a helmet, it was crushed on impact. When we arrived, the man was in shock, wandering around and picking up bits of his shattered bike. He had severe facial injuries. Most shockingly, he had no visible nose, having slid face-first across the pavement. Despite how horrifying it was, he survived. We later found the largest remaining piece of the motorcycle, the gas tank. It's a miracle he lived through it. Story 4. My father, a retired officer, once told me about one of the most unsettling cases he responded to. A man had stabbed an elderly woman and simply sat in the room afterward. When officers arrived, he didn't run or resist. He showed no emotion, just sat there as if nothing had happened. It was the emotional void that disturbed the officers more than the scene itself. Another story he mentioned was a tornado that tore through a trailer park back in the 1990s. The aftermath was so devastating, bodies were found tangled in tree branches. It left a lasting impact on everyone who responded. Story 5. My father rarely talked about what he saw on the job, but one night, after a few drinks, he opened up. He was working in a high-crime area in New York City. A young woman returning home late entered her apartment building and waited for the elevator. When it arrived, only one man was inside, someone who gave her an uneasy feeling. She got in anyway. The man had pressed the basement button, which normally should have been disabled at night. It hadn't been. He took her down, restrained her, and subjected her to hours of abuse. He then used her keys to find her apartment and abducted her roommate, another young woman. Both were assaulted before being discovered by maintenance staff the following morning. My father was one of the first responders. Both women survived, but the psychological wounds were deep. I think the reason he told us that story is because he had daughters himself, and it hit too close to home. Story 6. Back when I was working patrol, we were called out around midnight to respond to a report of vandalism at a hotel parking lot. Someone had broken into a guest's vehicle and stolen several items. While speaking with the car's owner, a woman on the third floor suddenly popped her head out of a window. She looked scared and said, "You need to be more aware of your surroundings." We paused, confused. One of us asked her to repeat herself, and she said again, "Just stay alert," before quickly pulling her head back in and slamming the window shut. It was eerie. We radioed in for backup and started scanning the area more carefully. Nothing came of it, but the whole thing left us on edge. She may have just been high or mentally unstable, but part of me still wonders if someone had been creeping up behind us and she scared them off. Story 7. A few weeks ago, I posted about one of my most intense calls. I was dispatched to help negotiate with a 17-year-old girl who had locked herself in a bathroom with scissors and knives. She had done a thorough job of barricading the door, wedged metal handles against it, opened all the drawers on the doorknob side to jam it further. SWAT eventually had to breach the wall to get inside. She wouldn't talk to me, but she was having conversations, very detailed ones, with her mother, who had passed away 3 years earlier, and her father, who was in prison for abusing her. When the team finally got her out, she had mutilated herself in ways I won't describe in full detail. What stunned me more than anything was that she never flinched. Her voice stayed calm, and even the entire time. She only got animated once, during an imaginary argument with her mom about how much pain her father had caused. She was otherwise flat-toned, even while describing to her dad how she'd been a good girl. I don't know if she had drugs in her system, probably, but once she was in the ambulance, my part was over. Still one of the most disturbing calls I've ever taken. Story 8. I got a dispatch about an abandoned vehicle parked along a winding stretch of highway. I was just a couple of miles away, so I arrived quickly. The road curved between a rock wall and a steep drop-off to a creek. It was pitch black, close to midnight. The truck was an old powder blue pickup from the 1950s, just sitting there with no one around. I approached cautiously, weapon drawn. The smell of alcohol in the air was strong, but no one was inside. I called for a tow and waited alone in the dark, right in the middle of a blind corner, not knowing where the driver had gone or why the truck was left there. Eventually, we traced the plates and located the owner at his house. He claimed he didn't know how the truck ended up there. We couldn't prove otherwise. I kept seeing that truck in the impound lot for months after. I don't think he ever reclaimed it. Story 9. There was a case involving a group of predators who had purchased a duplex. They lived on one side and rented the other side out to single mothers. They covered the windows of what we later discovered was their assault room with cartoon blankets. It was disturbing even before we knew the full scope of what had happened. By the time we visited the property with child services, most of the case had been wrapped up. Many of the mothers were addicted to hard substances and had been complicit, even facilitating what happened to their children. One of the suspects had avoided arrest due to lack of evidence, though he had prior convictions. I went upstairs to get his name for paperwork. He answered quietly while his girlfriend, angry and loud, shouted profanities at us. I wanted to react, but I didn't. I just got the information and left. It was hard to stay calm in a situation like that. Story 10. A distant relative of mine was adopted after a traumatic early childhood. The police had been called to her home for a drug-related issue, but during the search, they found her locked in a closet, naked and bound. Her father and his friends had been exploiting her in horrible ways. Her mentally impaired brother had also been forced to participate. After the adoption, she struggled a lot. She behaved almost like a wild animal for a long time. What always stuck with me was how officers could respond to things like that without losing control. I don't know how they manage it. That story hit me harder than most. Story 11. Self-life end cases always weigh heavy, and this one stuck with me. A man had ended his life in his garage using a large-caliber revolver. I'd seen scenes like this before, but what got to me was stepping on what I later realized was a piece of his eye. I spent nearly an hour afterward cleaning the bottom of my boots in the locker room, and again when I got home. It wasn't the creepiest scene I've ever had, but it was certainly the most unsettling in a personal way. I'd lost a close friend to suicide in high school, so these calls always hit a nerve. No matter how prepared you think you are, some things just stay with you. Story 12. We were called to a hotel just off the interstate. Housekeeping had tried to clean a room, but found the bathroom door closed and locked. On it was a note that read, "Don't open. Call 911. The front desk followed instructions and called us. We arrived, knocked, and got no answer. The hotel manager gave us the okay to force the door open. What we found was like a scene from a horror film. A man lay naked in the tub, a knife on the floor, with large amounts of blood in the water. His skin was pale, lips blue, and he didn't appear to be breathing. I told my partner there was no need for medics, he looked gone. But then my partner screamed. The man had moved. Somehow he still had a pulse. Medics were called immediately, and he was rushed to the hospital. He'd apparently cut himself just minutes before the maid found the note. He barely survived. It was a lesson I won't forget. Sometimes what looks obvious isn't. Story 13. While I was working as military police, the main office phone would sometimes ring with no one on the other end. One time, the caller ID didn't show a number, just a vague label like Emergency Line 11. I was new and reported it up the chain. I was told not to follow up and to forget it. Months later, I was on patrol when dispatch sent us to respond to an emergency call. The caller had sounded panicked and believed they were being followed. The strange part? The call came from that same Emergency Line 11. Dispatch had to dig out old base maps to locate it. We drove out to the site. All we found was the broken remains of a metal pole where the phone used to be. There was no one around. That was not a fun report to write. Story 14. I work in a school district and hear a lot of difficult things. What always rattles me are the cases where very young children report abuse, but don't know the proper words. Instead of saying something direct, they'll describe it using innocent terms like flower or cookie, and adults may not catch on right away. That's why I've taught my own 4-year-old the proper terms. A few months ago, she told me that her older half-brother had put a Nerf dart in her private area. It led to an investigation. She hasn't been back to her father's house since. It's horrifying, but it showed me how important it is that kids know how to describe these things clearly. The brother knew better, and I've made sure he's not allowed near her again. Sadly, her father denies it ever happened. The case is ongoing in family court. Story 15. I once responded to a fatal car crash involving 2 vehicles that collided head-on in a 55 miles per hour zone. One of the drivers had apparently left home with the intention of ending his life and chose a random car to crash into. What made it worse was that I had spoken with that driver just a few weeks before. Seeing his charred remains in the vehicle was jarring. The worst part? It happened on Christmas Day. The other driver's family lost someone because of a stranger's decision. That's something none of us could forget. Story 16. This one came from my dad's friend, a police officer who'd been drinking at our house one night and let this story slip. It was one of his first calls, about a little girl who showed up to school missing patches of hair. The school reported it, and when they visited the home, they found the mother beaten so badly that her eyes were swollen shut. Her own daughter didn't even recognize her. The father had flown into a rage that morning after learning the mother had sent the child to school, knowing the injuries would raise suspicion. He locked himself in a room and tried to escape out a window, but ended up running straight into a K-9 officer. The dog tore into his legs. Justice was served, but it wasn't a happy ending for the kid, who had lived through so much. Story 17. One day I responded to a call for an unresponsive infant. The family was oddly calm, standing outside and pointing into the house. I found the baby lying on a bare mattress, and though I began CPR, it was clear she was gone. At the hospital, I asked where she was, and a nurse handed her to me, wrapped in a blanket. As I stood there holding what looked like a sleeping baby, people walked by, smiling and commenting about how sweet it was to see an officer holding a child. I just nodded. Inside, I was breaking. Eventually, I was led to the morgue and left alone with her until the medical examiner arrived. I stayed there for over an hour. When I finally got home, I broke down. My own daughter was just a little older than the victim, and the quiet house felt unbearable. I didn't sleep at all before reporting back for another shift that evening. Story 18. We arrived at a motel after staff reported a suspicious note on a bathroom door. It said, "Do not enter. Call emergency services." The bathroom was locked, the guest hadn't checked out, and no one had seen him leave. After getting permission from management, we forced the door open. Inside, the man was lying in the tub, motionless, with blood in the water and a knife on the floor. Everything about him said he was gone. His skin tone, lack of movement, the scene itself. I told my partner he was clearly dead. But when he moved to check, he noticed a faint twitch. The man had a weak pulse. He was rushed to the hospital and survived. Turns out he'd made the cuts just minutes before staff found the note. I learned a lesson that day: always double check. It's not always what it seems at first glance. Story 19. This case came from a different jurisdiction. A little girl had been taken into protective custody after officers responded to a drug call at her home. They found her bound in a closet, unclothed. Her biological father and several others had been abusing her, and her mentally challenged brother had been forced to take part. She was adopted by a family member, but recovery took years. She barely spoke, acted like a feral child, and had to relearn how to function in a safe environment. It's one of those cases where your heart breaks over and over again. Story 20. I once responded to another infant death call and it ended up being one of the hardest of my career. The baby had reportedly died suddenly, and while no clear cause could be determined at the time, it was the mother's second child to pass under suspicious circumstances. I ended up helping remove her other kids from the home to protect them. Later, at the hospital, I was handed the swaddled body and asked to wait for the coroner. I stood there in uniform, holding what looked like a sleeping infant. People smiled at me, thinking it was a heartwarming moment. I just nodded and stayed quiet. When I got home, all I wanted was to hold my own daughter. But she was at daycare, and the house was empty. I stared at the walls, thinking about how easily. Story 21. Not a law enforcement officer myself, but I work in a school district and hear about troubling cases more often than you'd think. The ones that stay with me are the subtle ones. When a child uses the wrong words to describe something deeply serious. You'll have a kid who says their coach touched their flower, or that their uncle played with their cookie, and at first, adults might think they're talking about toys or something innocent. That's why I've made sure my own daughter knows the correct anatomical names for her body. One day, she told me that her older half-brother had put a Nerf dart somewhere it absolutely shouldn't have gone. She was brave enough to tell me, and we acted immediately. She hasn't been back to her father's house since. The authorities took it seriously, but the recommendations were disappointing. They said all visits between the children should now be supervised. But if supervision had been in place before, this never would have happened. We're currently in family court, and I'm doing everything in my power to protect my daughter. Story 22. I once responded to a duplex where several known offenders had been living together on one side and renting to single mothers on the other. When we got there with Child Protection Services to collect belongings for the kids, it was already a complicated case. The women renting had histories of drug abuse, and some had even been complicit in what had happened to their own children. Inside, one of the men, who had a prior conviction, was still living upstairs. He hadn't been formally arrested because the Special Victims Unit couldn't secure solid evidence against him. I went upstairs to get his full name for our report. He was quiet, clearly knew how close he had come to going back to prison. But his girlfriend? She started yelling at us, shouting insults and trying to provoke a reaction. I kept calm, but every part of me wanted to respond. Instead, I got what I needed and left. Some days, just walking away is the hardest thing to do. Story 23. This story came from a buddy of mine who volunteered for a rural fire department in the Colorado mountains. We were hanging out one day when he got called out to a motorcycle crash in a canyon. A biker had tried to pass a car on a curve and slammed right into an oncoming truck. His helmet shattered on impact. When first responders arrived, the man was still walking, disoriented and in shock, picking up parts of his bike. He'd slid down the road face first. Most of his nose was gone. What was left was more like a hole than a face. He looked skeletal, like a character out of a nightmare. My friend and I helped gather the wreckage. The biggest piece left of the motorcycle was the gas tank. It was unbelievable that the guy survived. Just shows what adrenaline and luck can do. Story 24. One of my calls involved a home welfare check. A neighbor hadn't seen the resident in days, and the lights were still on. We'd just had a snowstorm, and there weren't any tracks or tire marks around. I searched the house. Doors were unlocked, the man's wallet, phone, and keys were sitting out, and the TV was still playing. We searched everywhere, inside, outside, the garage, even the junk vehicles out back. Nothing. I put out a missing persons bulletin and started the paperwork. The next day, another officer followed up. Turns out the man had been plowing his driveway during the storm, had a medical emergency, and crashed into the row of old vehicles. The crash started a fire, and his remains weren't discovered until the snow melted enough to reveal them. I'd been just feet away from him the night before. It still gives me chills. Story 25. My dad was a police officer in New York City, in one of the most violent precincts at the time. He rarely shares stories from those days, but there's one he told after a few drinks that I'll never forget. A woman was coming home late from work. She entered the elevator in her apartment building and noticed a man already inside. Something about him felt off, but she got in anyway. The basement button was pressed, which was strange, because normally the building locked that floor after hours. The man took her down there and assaulted her. Then he used her keys to find her apartment, took her roommate, and brought her down too. He spent the whole night torturing both women. Maintenance found them the next morning. My dad was one of the responding officers. Both women survived, but the psychological damage was permanent. He never talked about work, but I think this case stuck with him because he had daughters. It still makes me sick to think about. Story 26. 911 dispatcher reporting in. Received a call from an elderly lady who had trouble breathing. I had taken several calls from her and her husband in the past, so I recognized her voice. I dispatched an ambulance to her residence and held her on the line, trying to keep her calm while the ambulance was responding. Ambulance advised that they have 15-minute ETA. She lived in a very rural part of WV. I'm talking to her, asking about her husband and how he was doing, and just making small talk with her. The ambulance calls in and advises they are on scene, and I let them know that she is in severe respiratory distress, and I still had her on the line. I let her know the ambulance is coming to the door to go answer the door, and she says okay, and hangs up the phone. Pretty normal, yeah? Well, here's where it gets weird. The EMT and paramedic on scene call back about a minute later and advises no one is answering the door. We have a sheriff unit who was in the area pulling on scene about that time. The sheriff unit confirmed the address and advised he is breaching the door to make access to the PT. 5 minutes go by and the paramedic on scene radios in asking who the caller was. I advise it was the elderly female who lived at the residence. He tells me that he's going to call in and needs to speak with the supervisor on shift. We get him over to the supervisor, and the supervisor confirms the information that I gave him and asks what's going on. Apparently the elderly female had been dead for a while and was already in full rigor mortis. They thought I was wrong on the caller, but the other dispatchers played it back and confirmed that it was the female who called. The ambulance transferred the hospital, and we got the same calls and disbelief from the doctors. Story 27. I am interning with a sheriff's police department, so most of my time is spent on patrol. We got called out to do a wellness check, which the deputy thought was going to be a piece of cake, like she was out of town or something. We get there and are met by the neighbors who told us that the mail is piling up in the mailbox and that there are several untouched packages on the porch. Okay, so we go up the house and the front door is unsecured, so we crack open the door a couple of inches and the deputy calls inside, but the door won't move anymore. The house was one of those split houses where the stairs meet at the front door and the upstairs and downstairs are offset, so we concluded that there might be stuff behind the door. It's about this time that the deputy tells me that she is a known hoarder, and that could be why the door was stuck. He also mentions that if we see flies on the inside of the windows, she is most likely inside and deceased. As we walk around the side of the house, we notice a lot of flies on the windows. The back door was locked, and as we looked in, we noticed bags on bags of garbage diapers and miscellaneous shit all over the place. We head back to the front and attempt to make entry. He pushes the door open, this time with more force, and from underneath I see a grease-like liquid spreading out from under the door. The deputy stops, closes the door, and calmly tells me that the lady was indeed dead and wedged behind the door. From the dates of the packages, we concluded that she had been gone about 2 months. Once we did make entry into the house, I was allowed inside. After 2 months, she didn't even look like a human corpse. Her skin and body had sagged and melted to the floor, and her face. Her face was all black and had been eaten to the bone by maggots. I'll never forget the smell when the coroners moved her and she popped. It was like a physical presence. Whatever those people get paid to deal with that shit, it's not enough. The thing that really got to me, though, was wondering if she had fallen down the stairs and died there, or if she fell and was unable to move and waited for help that would never come. Story 28. Got a report of a missing husband. He told his wife and family of 6 children that he was going to get his tires changed, but never returned, and this was 12 hours ago. They had purchased another house in a neighboring community, and the relationship with the wife was under pressure, so the wife assumed he was staying at the other house and claimed he would never kill himself. The strange thing about this report, though, was that he emptied his personal bank account into his wife's this morning as well. The wife explained this off, saying that they recently had a fight about finances, and he agreed that he was bad at money, and maybe they should just have a joint account that she controls. On a hunch, I asked his 14-year-old boy if there were any areas in the mountains nearby that his father enjoyed going, and the son identified a road about 10 miles away. It was nearing midnight, but I decided to drive to the top of this old and abandoned Forest Service road. As I drove through the snow and started to climb the road, I felt a gut feeling that I would 100% find this guy up there either thinking about or already acted out a suicide. The snow-laid gravel road had some sign of travel, but no real indication of how fresh the vehicle tracks could be. As I reached the top of the road after an hour of travel, I was honestly surprised that I did not find his black truck. I spent the drive back down thinking about gut feelings and how they are unreliable, but that I somehow felt different about this one. As I traveled up the road, I did notice over a dozen smaller roads branching off, but they were not mapped, and I had already spent too much time on a single occurrence in a busy city with too few police officers. Nonetheless, I decided to check a single of these secondary roads, and about March 4ths of the way down I picked a road at random to check, and sure enough my headlights lit up the back end of a black truck about 100 yards past the first corner. Even if I hadn't memorized the license plate beforehand, I wouldn't have had to run it. It was clearly his. I radioed that I had found the truck, parked my vehicle, and traveled the 20 feet to his truck with my heart beating, like I was doing it at a sprint rather than a normal walk. What I found inside was a mess of brains and blood caused by a self-inflicted shotgun wound under the chin. I'll save you from the description. There was just something about that gut feeling while traveling this abandoned and quiet mountain road, followed by a sense of being tricked by the gut feeling, then finding out it was true by discovering such a gruesome scene, having to wait 3 hours next to his truck waiting for body removal, and then to end it all by having to go to the family, who was expecting good news, to deliver to them the worst news possible. That makes me feel creeped out to this day. Story 29. I responded to a report of an unresponsive infant. When I arrived, all the family members were standing around casually in the front yard pointing into the house. I found the baby in the back room laying on her back on a bare mattress. I started CPR, but realized the baby was probably already deceased. We rushed her out to the arriving ambulance, hoping they had a way to bring her back. I learned she was the mother's second suspicious SIDS death, and I had her other children removed from her care. The difficult part was when I left the scene and went to the ER to see what came of the situation. As I walked in and asked where she was, an ER nurse walked over to me and handed me the deceased baby swaddled in a blanket and told me to wait for someone to show me to the morgue. So I'm standing there in the ER in uniform holding what everyone thinks is a live infant, but rather an infant corpse, and several people stopped by wanting to see her and commenting on how cute it is to see an officer holding a baby. I just smiled, but it killed me inside. I was ushered back to the morgue after what felt like an eternity, and told I had to wait with the baby until the medical examiner arrived. They took the blankets off and laid her on a stainless steel gurney and left me alone with her again. I lounged around the morgue for about an hour waiting. By the time I got home several hours after the end of my shift, because this call came out 15 minutes before the end of my 10-hour shift, I laid down on my bed and cried for a long time. My young daughter was in daycare and my wife at work. I really needed to hold both of them, so the house felt incredibly empty. My daughter was only slightly older than the infant, and when I was looking at her earlier, I kept seeing my own daughter. I didn't get any sleep at all before going back in for the next shift later that night. Story 30. Self-life-taking is a strange thing. My grandpa was helping my cousin work on her school project. He got up for a glass of water and dropped the glass in the sink where it broke. He then proceeded to get her stuff up and take her down the street to our aunt's house, dropped her off while acting completely fine, drove back home, and shot himself in his bedroom. We also wondered if there was some condition he didn't tell us about. But 2 years before he killed himself, his youngest daughter died from cancer. She was only 29 at the time. My cousin, who he was helping with the project, was one of the 3 kids that she left behind. I was a kid at the time, but I still remember him telling me that sometimes he'd wake up at night hearing my aunt calling his name. I think he just never figured out how to cope. I think one of you said it perfectly. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. My grandma had left town for a couple days to help her sick sister, and in that moment, something broke inside of him. The perfect opportunity was there. We lived next door, and I remember trying to break in the door because I was worried about him. His car was there, but he wouldn't answer the door or the phone. Finally, I told my dad, and he ended up kicking the door in and finding him. I think that's the part that people don't think about when they do something like that. Somebody has to find you, and it's going to F them up. Please, if you're reading this and you've been thinking about doing something like this, don't. I promise things can get better, even if it seems like it won't. And I promise that there is someone out there who would be crushed, devastated, who would then go through the same kind of hurt that you were feeling. Just hold on. Story 31. Detention officer at a local jail here. We had a guy get brought in about 2 a.m. one night who we immediately knew was about to give us a fun time based on the way he was moving, quickly snapping the head back and forth, looking all over the room, etc. One of my co-workers and I stay with the booking officer to help her out when the shit inevitably hits the fan. The guy keeps rambling on throughout the whole process. Parts of his speech are understandable, but most of it is gibberish. At one point he looks up at my co-worker and says, "Would you blame me for it?" Trying to keep the guy calm, my co-worker tells him, "Nah man, no one can blame you." For whatever reason this set the guy off. He leaps off the bench, and we both push him back down. My coworker is trying to get handcuffs on his other wrist. He was already handcuffed by one hand to the bench, and I'm holding him against the wall with every bit of strength I have. This motherfucker was strong. I swear the bench was about to come up off the concrete when he first leapt at us. Once my coworker gets handcuffs on him, we take a step back. The guy throws his head back, eyes rolled all the way back, and lets out an inhuman scream that I've only heard in movies about demon possession. He then moves his head as if he's looking around the room, but still with his eyes rolled into the back of his head, and spouts off more nonsense. I'm not Catholic, but I was very tempted to cross myself. The screaming, head throwing back, and eye rolling continue on for about 45 minutes. Every so often he'd come back to reality and talk to us like a normal person for a moment, and then go back into crazy mode. Story 32. I was new on the force and sent to a home invasion in progress late in the night. I noticed my training officer didn't seem to be too concerned and responded slowly as opposed to the normal emergency response for crimes in progress. Upon arrival, he asked me if I had been to the home before. After I said no, he told me to go handle the call. As I walked towards the home, the garage opened and an elderly lady who was bent at a 90 degrees angle at her waist hobbled out. Without looking at me, she said to hurry due to the fact that the two black male suspects were still in the home. She used much more colorful and racist language. I noted that she couldn't straighten her back and realized she was a bit off mentally. I then walked into the home with her behind me. While my eyes adjusted to the interior, I heard a click. I turned to find the lady locking two padlocks on the interior of the door. I then noted, as we were within the kitchen, that every cabinet and pantry also had a secured padlock on their doors. I looked down the hallway and found that every interior door of the small home was shut and secured with padlocks. I followed the elderly woman down the hall to the second door on the left. She began to unlock the padlock to the door and shouted, "They are in here." To my surprise, within the room, there was an older white guy sitting at a table using a desktop computer. He looked at me, greeted me, identified himself as the woman's husband, and then went back to whatever he was doing. The woman then pointed at an empty chair and began to yell, "They are under the chair." "Oh no, they just ran outside right there." The woman was pointing at a wall. After waiting for the woman to lock her husband back into the room, and then waiting for her to let me out of the kitchen door, I cursed my training officer and hightailed it out of there. That was my first exposure to mental illness, and it was creepy. My training officer said the woman had supposedly been raped by two black males years ago, which had caused her mental break and her animosity towards those of the race.